Hey, what's up, guys, and welcome back to Metal Building Coach. This is Module 1, the basics, Session 3, Metal Building Components. So in this session, we're going to dig deep into the elements that make up a metal building. And once we're done here, you should have a really good idea of how a metal building project will all come together. So let's get into it then. So first I want to go over the primary and secondary framework of a metal building. So these two elements really make up the majority of your building's strength. So these two components are really the main structural components of the building. So you have your primary framework, which are your columns and your rafters. You'll generally see those as I-beams or red iron, something along those lines. And then running perpendicular and sitting on top or outside of your primary framework, you have what's called your secondary framework. So these two combined really make up this skeleton of your building. And you can kind of see it a little bit better here in this cross section. So you have your red iron column and rafter here making up your primary framework, and then you have sitting on top of that your secondary framework illustrated here. Understanding of the Okay, so now that you have a pretty good understanding of a building's primary framework, let's talk a little bit about its secondary framework. So when it comes to a building's secondary framework, there are really two structural elements. You have what are called purlins, and those are going to be the structural components that sit in the roof, and then you have what are called girts, and those structural elements make up the walls. So we're not going to go into too much depth here, but again, the key takeaway is purlins are in the roof, girts are in the walls. Alright, so on this slide we're going to talk about the building's or a building's roof and wall panels. So whereas before we were kind of talking about the main structural components of a building, its primary and secondary framework, its bones, now we're going to talk about its skin or its roof and wall panels. So when it comes to roof and wall panels, the industry pretty well all uses the same standard. That standard is a 26 gauge PBR profile panel. So a couple key takeaways here. The gauge of the panel just refers to its thickness, and 26 gauge is the industry standard, although on occasion you will see 24 gauge and sometimes even 22 gauge, but those are generally saved for higher end commercial projects, just because there is quite a bit of cost associated with that. So again, 26 gauge is the standard. The gauge of the panel is the thickness of the panel, and then you've got a general profile. The standard profile is a PBR profile, as you can see here. And a PBR profile is basically just 1.25 inch high ribs. These are ribs here, on 12-foot centers. And then your standard panel width is going to be 36 inches. So this is just kind of a profile or a cross section of what the panel would be, or what it's going to look like. So another kind of important element to your roof and your wall panels is the use of Galvalume. So this right here in this box, this swatch if you will, this is Galvalume. Galvalume is generally used in the roof of metal buildings that have a low pitch. The reason why they do this is because it's about 18 to 22 cents less per square foot to use a Galvalume panel versus a painted color panel. And if your roof isn't very visible, no one's really going to see it, so they just kind of go with the less costly option there. That being said, obviously if you have a steeper roof pitch, or if you just want a color roof panel, that's certainly available. Alright, so next we're going to talk about the trim of a metal building. So the trim of a metal building basically breaks down into 5 different elements or locations. So you have your eave trim, which is located at the building's eave on its side walls here. Then you have the rake or gable trim, which is the trim pieces located on the building's end walls or gable walls, and that's the trim piece that runs from the eave to the peak and then back down to the other eave there. Then you've got what's called your corner trim, and just like it sounds, that's just the trim on the building's 4 corners. Then you have what's called a base trim, which again pretty straightforward here. That is the trim that runs along the base of the building. And then finally we have the framed opening trim, and that just refers to the trim that basically trims out all your doors, windows, any sort of framed opening that you have in the building will generally have some sort of trim associated with it. Alright, so next we've got metal building bracing. So when it comes to metal building bracing, a lot of people get confused because they're not really sure what it is, what it does. Basically, at its most simplest level, bracing acts as a kind of way to tie the building together. So you've got what's called X bracing, or actually I should say you have 2 bracing options. You have X bracing, which you can see here, is essentially made up of cables that are bolted to the ground and then run up and are bolted into your primary framework. And this kind of, like I said, pulls everything together. So then you have what's called a portal frame, which you can see indicated here. Now, a portal frame is generally used in lieu or instead of X bracing. There's a couple different scenarios where you're going to want to use portal frames, but we'll get into that later. But for the most part, I'd say 90% of buildings just use X bracing as its main form of bracing because it is the most cost-effective type of bracing. Okay, and finally we've got our framed openings. Now, a framed opening, pretty straightforward, pretty simple here. Basically just refers to any openings that you're going to put in your building. So any overhead door openings, any walk or man door openings, or any window openings will be framed out with structural elements to help support anything that you're going to, or I guess any sort of door that you're going to hang in there or window that you're going to hang in there, and then also to kind of distribute the load of the building around that door or window or whatever it is that you're going to put in there. So pretty straightforward here, guys. Those are kind of the basic metal building components. If you know this stuff, you're going to do just fine moving forward.